Okay, Maddie, you're all set.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie.
Mhm.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Stephanie said, my name is Madeline Potter, and I am happy that you are joining us on your lunch hour, hour and a half, to talk about pollinators and Pollinator Week that is coming up next month. So today's webinar is titled Pollinator Power, Tools, Resources, and Outreach Strategies for National Pollinator Week. So since we are in a webinar format, there will be a lot of polls that I'll use today to engage with you all. So get ready. You can also interact through putting comments and thoughts in the chat box, as Stephanie was mentioning. And then if you have any questions for me that you would like me to answer at the end, please put those in the Q&A chat, or Q&A feature, I should say. But lots of opportunities to chat amongst ourselves, even though we are in this virtual platform. So as we're getting started here, I'll put up our university's assurance statement, as well as our Injustice for All poster. So what are we going to talk about today? So here's a layout of all the different topics that we're going to be covering. First of which will be pollinators and why they need our help. So a little bit of background information. Some of you may already know a lot about our pollinators, but there's always so much more to learn, and there's still so much we don't know about our pollinators. So we'll start there, and then we'll lead into National Pollinator Week and its key objectives, why it's important, why we should get involved and help celebrate it wherever we are. Next, we'll talk about partners in pollination, speaking about outreach tools and tips. And then last but not least, we'll conclude with growing the change, working together to make an impact. So let's begin our journey today with pollinators and why they need our help. So up on the screen now, we have some key pollinator groups that can be found in Maryland. So take a moment here. If you're still filling out that demographic poll, feel free to take your time. But if you're finished with it, look on your screen and see if you can begin to identify these different distinct groups. So each one of these circles has a representative individual from this particular group. So we may have begun to recognize some of these, including our hummingbirds, bees, wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, and beetles. So you may or may not be surprised by some of those groups. A lot of people don't know that our flies and our beetles, for instance, are also really important pollinators and a part of our pollinator communities. So to get started, I'm going to launch a quick poll. I can pull that up here. It's going to be our poll for our pollinators. So you can vote on which of these is your favorite pollinator group. And then from there, I'm going to choose the most popular pollinator and the least popular pollinator to learn more about at the beginning of today's presentation. Awesome. So on your screen, you should see a poll with just one question, and you're just selecting your top favorite pollinator group as of now. Whenever we get a good amount of respondents, we'll go ahead and end that poll and reveal the results so we can explore some of our key pollinator groups.
We've got 89% on there. You want me to end it and share?
Sure, that works. Thank you, Stephanie.
Here we go. And share results. Okay,
awesome.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And looks like we have bees as the winner, and then our least popular is going to be moths. So we're going to explore both bees and moths this afternoon. So we'll start with the bees. Here we go. So here are just some key facts, fun facts about our bee pollinators. We have over 400 different native bee species here in Maryland. Approximately 70% of native bees nest underground. The remaining approximately 30% of those native bee species will nest in cavities like plant stems, tunnels in wood, other crevices maybe made by rock piles. Approximately 25% of native bees are pollen specialists. What does this mean? Well, it means they only collect and rely on pollen from a small group of plant species to feed their young. So one key example of this is our spring beauty mining bee. She only collects pollen from two spring beauty native plant species, the Virginia spring beauty and the Carolina spring beauty. And this pollen is used to feed larval bees, and the larval bees only feed on pollen from these two particular species. So it's really vital to have that native species present to support different pollinators like our pollen specialists. Most native bees are not aggressive and not defensive of their nest. So a lot of our ground nesting native bees, for instance, get mistaken for an aggressive wasp, like say our yellow jackets. Some of us have an unfortunate experience of getting stung by one of these flying ground nesting insects, but it was likely some sort of wasp, as our native ground nesting bees, I've walked amongst them, they are not defensive. They are not aggressive. They will only sting if we were to handle them or actually accidentally get them against our skin. So it's really important to recognize them and differentiate them from our wasp species, for instance. So some of our more aggressive ones like yellow jackets, because they're losing a lot of their habitat. And we want to conserve ground nesting bees where we can. General flower preferences for bees include blue and yellow flowers, but this can vary quite drastically as we have a huge diversity of different bee species, as we've learned. Now, our example bee on the screen on our left is a small carpenter bee species. So really tiny. Not all of our bees are big and fuzzy, like say our bumblebees. Some are smaller. And so this is one particular species that may be mistaken for a wasp or some sort of other insect because it is so small. So those are our bees. Now let's take a look at our moth pollinators. So moths can contribute to daytime and or nighttime pollination for our night blooming flowers. So we do have some flowers that will only bloom at night or have a period at dawn or dusk where they are blooming. So it really depends on the moth species for what time of day they're active. Some may even be active at both the daytime or say dawn and dusk. Some of our moths are migratory and can travel long distances like our butterflies, which helps to facilitate plant genetic diversity by moving that pollen, that genetic material around between different plant species individuals. Sphinx moths, like the one on our left, belonging to the moth family Sphingidae, are sometimes mistaken for hummingbirds because they can be quite large, and the way that they fly looks like they're hovering similar to a hummingbird. They also have this really long proboscis, so they're able to reach into some of our deeper, more tubular flowers to reach that sugary nectar that they are seeking. General flower preferences include pale or white flowers that are cup or tubular shaped, fragrant, and bloom at dawn or dusk. So again, it really depends on the species, but these are just some general flower preferences to keep in mind when we're planting for our different pollinators. Awesome. If we have time at the end, we can visit some of our other key pollinator groups. And a little bit later, I'll talk about a resource where all of these different groups can be looked at and some of their fun facts, key traits on your own. So we can't talk about pollinators without talking about pollination. And sometimes it really helps to go back to the basics, right? Especially if we are an educator of some kind or we engage in public outreach. It's important to help people understand what pollination is, and that's why it's really important when it comes to food production as well as the reproduction of native plants and supporting our different ecosystems. So I like to show this little graphic of our example pollinating bee here coming across a flower searching for nectar. And so a lot of our pollinating species are out there looking for nectar to supplement their diet, or maybe it's their entire diet. And while they are feeding from that nectar from a flowering plant, their body comes into contact with different reproductive organs of our flowers and picks up pollen grains. This is genetic material that needs to be passed on to other plants in order to facilitate that reproductive process, right? So moving the pollen grains from the male to the female reproductive parts of our flowers. Now, some flowering plants have what's called self-pollination, so they don't need, say, a helper like a pollinator to move these pollen grains between reproductive parts. But a lot of our plants require what's called cross-pollination, which is what our pollinators help to do. So things like insects and hummingbirds and other animals that help to move the pollen between plants. And this facilitates fertilization and the production of fertile seeds. So once these seeds are formed, hopefully we're able to grow some new plants or also to produce fruit and crops that we use to eat. So based on the research and from what we can tell, approximately 75 to 95% of the world's flowering plants rely on pollinators to reproduce or rely on some form of cross-pollination. Approximately 35% of the world's food crops rely on pollinators to reproduce. And up on the screen, we have some crops that rely on some form of pollinator, whether it be an insect or other animal. So things like our apples, our beloved chocolate if we're a chocolate fan, potatoes, strawberries, coffee, almonds, and more. 25 to 50% of flower visits in agricultural ecosystems are by non-bee insect pollinators like our fly pollinator pictured on our left. So what we've been finding with more research is that our flies, especially our what are called our syrphid flies or our hover flies, are really important pollinators when it comes to a lot of our food crops. And so more and more agricultural systems are finding ways to better support fly pollinator populations in order to support our different food production systems. Now, unfortunately, our pollinators are facing a lot of different stressors. You may have seen this slide before in some of my previous talks, but it never gets old to repeat the fact that if we stay on the track that we're on now, we could lose up to 80% loss in biomass of important insect pollinator taxa alone. So that's just our insect pollinators. That's just one subset of beneficial insects as well. We also have our decomposers, our nutrient cyclers, our predatory insects. We have our hummingbirds. So a lot of these different animals and pollinators are getting affected by all sorts of things like the different factors shown on the infographic on the right side of our screen. So things like urbanization, pollution, agricultural intensification, insecticides, deforestation, and so on. And this lends into why it's important to celebrate Pollinator Week, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because more and more we're seeing evidence that our pollinators are taking a huge hit when it comes to the impacts of continued use of pesticides and other chemicals, as well as habitat loss. So I'm going to review some of these different research papers that have been recently released and the different things that we can learn from them, especially as we form our own outreach and education materials with the general public. So the first paper shows how indirect effects of pesticides on different arthropods and insects can be found through all different types of chemicals, not only just our, say, insecticides or pesticides. Our fungicides that we may apply, as well as our herbicides, can have negative effects on our pollinators and beneficial insects. There are many different ways for our pollinators to be exposed to pesticides other than maybe direct contact between the pesticide and the individual pollinator itself. We can also have residue contact, so the pollinator comes a bit later and gets into contact with any residue that's left on, say, the plant that was sprayed. There can also be contaminated nesting material. So our insects not only rely on plants for food or say our pollinators, but also utilize different plant parts for nesting. So one example of this is our leafcutter bees, which take circular leaf cut sections out of different leaf and flower petal materials to form nests for her young. So if these leaves or flower petals had been sprayed with some sort of pesticide that sticks around, she could be bringing that back to her young where she will lay her eggs and potentially contaminate them, unfortunately. Also, since we've learned that approximately 70% of our native bees are ground nesting, there are a lot of different ways that when we're spraying the ground or the turf or the lawn, for instance, with different chemicals, that it could contaminate those nests that are underground with our ground nesting bees. Also, not all pesticides are the same. Some have higher impacts and risks than others. Things like neonicotinoids, for instance, which can be more broad spectrum and can target more than just one particular insect species, but lots of different insect species, including our pollinating insects. So this is an example, a case study that the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation talks about quite a bit, which was an incident that happened where a type of neonicotinoid pesticide was sprayed called dinotafron on 55 linden trees, and it resulted in the death of over 50,000 bumblebees. And so pictured on our right, all those little black things on the parking lot that we can see are unfortunately past bumblebees. So it's important to be really mindful of the type of pesticides not only we are potentially applying to our landscapes, but if we're hiring a professional to come out and to treat for a certain pest, that we have a conversation with them. We're knowledgeable about what chemicals and products that they may be using, because we have a choice, right? We are hiring them for our own spaces. Now, luckily, we have what's called the Maryland Pollinator Protection Act of 2016. Which means that neonicotinoids cannot be applied outdoors by home gardeners in Maryland. So this varies by state, and only farmers and certified pesticide applicators can apply this type of pesticides. Now, neonicotinoids are still widely used by landscape pest professionals who have this pesticide applicator license, so something to be mindful of if we are working with those professionals. This recent study was released, which found between 2000 and 2020, total butterfly abundance fell by 22% across the 554 recorded species. They also cited that insecticides have been identified as leading causes of butterfly declines in recent analyses in the Midwestern US and California. And so what this means, as shown by our graphic on the bottom left, is for every 5 butterflies we saw 20 years ago, today we are only seeing 4. Now, other than pesticides and their serious impacts on our pollinators, we also have a changing climate that they are dealing with. So things like phenological mismatches can result from a changing climate. Phenology is the timing of biological events, like the timing of when plants bloom and when bees emerge. So we can have a mismatch between these two different biological events. So for example, depending on the species, they use different cues for when to say emerge or to bloom. So for example here, let's say our ground nesting bee, or native ground nesting bee, uses temperature as a cue for when they should emerge come spring from their overwintering sites underground. Now, let's say their host plant, though, uses day length as their cue for when they should begin to bloom. So because of this, because they could potentially be using different cues, we could have a mismatch where, say, our pollinator is emerging earlier than the bloom period of the flower, and thus they don't have nectar resources available. Or say our flowering plant is blooming earlier than the emergence of our pollinator. So we have both cases potentially happening. And this can also vary with its impact depending on how many host plants that this pollinator needs, right? We have some of our pollinator specialists that rely on only a couple species or a small group of plants. So if that mismatch is there, that's going to be potentially devastating to that pollen specialist versus our generalists that may be able to use lots of different types of plant species. And a paper that looked at evidence of this phenological mismatch was done in Costa Rica. And what was alarming is that they found pollinators emerging 17 to 38 days earlier than the flowering of their main host plant species. So, yes, this was in Costa Rica, but it is a case study. It's an example of how drastic this mismatch can potentially be, not only in Costa Rica, but in other parts of our world. Now, within any of our spaces, whether we're in a rural or an urban environment, we have different managed spaces and hardscapes or hard structures like roads. And these come in between our larger green spaces, which we can call our more conservation areas. And so this can inhibit a lot of our pollinators and wildlife from reaching some vital habitat that they may need to survive and to reproduce. This habitat fragmentation, as we call it, can have lots of different impacts from anywhere from biodiversity loss, higher extinction risks, altered migration patterns, and so on. Now, I know we're talking a lot of doom as we're starting here, but it's really important to note that we can make a difference. It's important to be aware of these different uh, research studies and evidence that we're finding so we can let the public know, and we can also spark a fire within ourselves and our community members that the time to take action for pollinators is now. And so this particular study found that environmental educational programs can achieve effective outcomes. Now, what they found is a combination of connecting with local communities and local problems and goals, collaborating, measuring and reporting, and taking physical action, all lent to effective outcomes within different spaces. And so this is where we come in, right? We can work together, whether we are a Maryland Master Gardener or work with some other organization. We can work together to have an impact to make a change within our own community spaces. And one of my favorite at-home examples of this is showing the data from last year, 2024, for amplifying this impact, right? And so I'm part of the group all the way on the left, approximately 27 home horticulture faculty and staff with the University of Maryland Extension. And we're charged with educating our Maryland Master Gardeners along with the general public. And so from there, if we're teaching the Master Gardeners, over 2,000 of them, they're going out into the community and reaching even more people. And so the impact amplifies, right? So we can do this with our pollinator outreach and education to reach over 50,000 people throughout Maryland. Now, before we get into our next section of National Pollinator Week objectives, I do want to put up a quick poll to check in with who is joining us today. I know most of us are likely Maryland Master Gardeners, but there could be a couple of us that are tuning in from other organizations. With our Spotted Lanternfly webinar last summer, if you joined me for that, we had a couple out-of-state guests as well. So if you are able, please fill out this poll to let me and us know who joins us for these webinars.
Sorry, it looks like there's an extra blank question, number 3. So just ignore that one.
So I'll give you all a minute or two to fill that out.
I'm seeing some comments in the chat, so if you can't see the poll, try checking under some other windows that you might have up on your computer. And if you're only seeing one question, remember to scroll down. Okay, do you want me to end it?
Yes, that works. Thanks, Stephanie.
Okay, do you need to share these or no?
No, not this poll, but thank
Okay,
you.
got it. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you all for taking the time to fill that out. Let's go ahead and get started with our next section of National Pollinator Week objectives. So I like to think of today as our pep rally, as we are about a month out from National Pollinator Week. So National Pollinator Week is June 16th through the 22nd for this year of 2025. And I took this screen grab, which is why it's a little blurry for Pollinator Week. There is a countdown on the Pollinator Partnership website, and we are 32 days away from this National Pollinator Week. So what is Pollinator Week? Pollinator Week began as an initiative by the nonprofit Pollinator Partnership. It became nationally recognized in 2008 when the US Senate unanimously designated a week in June as National Pollinator Week. And so there are a lot of resources on the Pollinator Partnership website for Pollinator Week if you'd like to learn more. And I pulled this quote from their website where they have stated that under the inspiring theme, Pollinators Weave Connections, this year's event urges us to appreciate the essential role pollinators play in creating and expressing human culture in all of its forms. And so each year they design a different poster for Pollinator Week, and we can see this year's poster on our right. And if we take a zoom in, we can see closer the different cultural aspects that pollinators play into, including nutrition, medicinal, heritage, fibers, symbolism, and ceremonial. So if you want to get a closer look at this poster, if you want a poster for yourself, feel free to check out their website at pollinator.org. They also list previous year's posters, which are really cool to also check out. So here is a screenshot of what their website looks like, especially if you go to their Pollinator Week tab. They have lots of other resources outside of Pollinator Week. And they also focus on, excuse me, one type of pollinator each year. And this year's focus is on squash bees. And so they have different graphics that you can share in different languages. And that's what's shown in the circle on our left. So we have an example squash bee graphic with our Pollinator Week and our week dates. So from here, we can pull some key objectives for what Pollinator Week is all about. The first of which is to raise public awareness about pollinators, to increase understanding of the vital role pollinators play in ecosystems, agricultural, and cultural connections. Next is to promote pollinator-friendly practices and to encourage individuals and communities to adopt sustainable actions that benefit pollinator health. Next, to inspire community engagement and action to empower people to take on hands-on steps to support pollinators at a local level. To celebrate cultural connections to pollinators, so highlighting how pollinators are woven into cultural traditions, art, food, history, and more. Build lasting partnerships, so strengthening networks among schools, nonprofits, agencies, and businesses working on pollinator conservation. I know a lot of us are doing this already outside of even our pollinator-focused work, but this is an opportunity to collaborate and to strengthen those different networks to have an even greater impact. And that leads into our last objective, which is to amplify impact through visibility, ensuring all Pollinator Week activities contribute to a broader awareness and action, and that we're designing different spaces and activities for all different types of people and backgrounds. So some things to keep in mind in terms of how we would like to celebrate Pollinator Week and get involved. We could focus on one of these objectives, two of these objectives, whatever works for us. And this goes back to that piece, that research paper that found that it was really important to focus on that local level, which is you all in your communities doing that work and making those connections. That leads us into our third topic for today, which is partners in pollination, outreach tools and tips. So as we lead into this part, I have a quick activity or a thought brainstorming session for what sparks your curiosity. I know with a lot of the different programs and outreach that I do and develop, a lot of it comes from my own curiosity as well as learning about the curiosity and interests of others. And so what really drew you to your work and what you do today, whether that be for your professional career, or if you are a volunteer or a community member, whatever it is, I'd like for you to take a moment to think about what inspires you when it comes to pollinators. Is there a particular pollinator, pollinator plant, or question that first sparked your curiosity or still does today? And then what makes you want to learn more or share that fascination with others? So if you're willing to, I encourage you to share some of your comments and thoughts regarding these questions and prompts below in the chat box. I'd love for us to engage and hear from one another because I know we all come from different backgrounds and perspectives when it comes to pollinators. I know one of my first interests when it came to pollinators was learning about our different moth pollinators, especially those sphinx moths like the one pictured on our right. I was amazed at how big some of our moths can be, how their behavior can be quite similar to our hummingbirds. And I always found it really thrilling and heartwarming when I spotted one of these hawk moths or sphinx moths flying around, especially at dawn and dusk. Awesome. I see a comment about doing research and understanding the preference of pollinators in one habitat over another. That's always really important and really fascinating. I see someone who loves Halictidae. That's a great family for sweat bees, a lot of our native smaller bees. Love for bee diversity. Beauty of the Luna moth. Yes, they are really spectacular. The swallowtail butterfly and their eggs. Amazing. Thank you all for sharing. So I encourage you all to check out the chat and all the different responses. This is great. So I'm going to overview some key lessons for designing impactful extension and outreach programs. Now, I am still fairly early in my extension career, but I've learned a lot from you all working with the general public and Master Gardener volunteers, as well as some of my fellow faculty and staff. So I've put together some key lessons that I've learned so far, and I found to be really helpful when I'm designing different outreach and extension programs. So the first of which is start with a purpose, identifying clear learning objectives, defining what you want your audience to know, feel, or do by the end. Use these objectives to guide your planning and communicate them up front to keep the experience focused and meaningful. Know your audience, understand who they are, what they care about, and how they prefer to learn. Meet them where they are. And I find that if you're able to do some sort of pre-survey, if you're doing a sit-down workshop or class, this can be really helpful to gauge background, experience, and interest. And this leads into conducting needs assessments. This might be different for different positions or roles that we play. If we are a master gardener, we can work with our master gardener coordinator to conduct different needs assessments for different communities and groups. And this can be really important to be able to identify key needs for different communities. So asking questions, gathering input, and using data to designate content that is timely, relevant, and wanted. Next is to design thoughtfully. Plan for more time than you think you will need. I've been learning this over and over again. If you may have noticed, I've changed my webinars from an hour to now an hour and a half to give myself some more time so it's not so rushed. And also understanding that different people prefer different lengths of programs, right? I've heard feedback from you all that some of us like our longer format webinars, while some of us may prefer a more shorter format webinar or workshop. So it's really important to consider that input and to provide a diversity of different mediums and content. Always making it interactive. So even more in this webinar format, finding ways to do interactive polls, to encourage people to engage in the chat, to utilize different discussion boards, that can be really helpful. And then of course, when we're in person, being able to have some more hands-on engagement there. Mentioned diversifying our medium. So finding what we are feeling really good about using, whether that be maybe social media or designing some sort of hands-on workshop, or if we're more artsy, designing flyers, handouts, displays. There are all different ways that we can engage with our different communities and teach people about our pollinators. And we can also collaborate for accessibility. We can work with community partners, especially to translate different materials in different languages and to adapt to different community needs. Next, staying impact focused. And so when we can, finding some way to evaluate the program or the activity that we have led, so we can take this into consideration and improve upon it for the next activity or program, maybe say next pollinator week for 2026. We can identify some of our more high impact opportunities, especially for dealing with time management. And we can end with a call to action. So I always like to have some sort of key message, get people to think about one key action that they plan to do after leaving the workshop or program. So they have something focused in their mind that they can work on and take away with them. Next, we can connect and collaborate. We can encourage open dialogue within our sessions, especially when we're in person. We can network and build relationships with different communities, organizations, schools, and leaders, and always listening and being open to feedback. I say this especially for today and myself. If you ever have any feedback about any of my webinars or programs, feel free to reach out to me. And then last is to stay flexible and passionate. If we're doing some sort of presentation, especially in front of an audience, I always like to practice my key points, but maybe not memorize a whole dialogue. This helps us feel more smooth with how we're speaking, as well as allow us some flexibility to speak on different points that may come up that are unplanned. So being adaptable, being able to pivot, as we never know how our audience may change. We may not have all the details coming into a certain situation. So being able to adapt as we can. And then I think the most important part is to make it fun and also pull from personal experiences. People can really feel your passion and excitement, and that can be contagious. I know the reason I got into the world of insects is because of passionate educators, and that's what really led to what I do today, and hopefully being able to spark that passion within others. Here is also 5 steps to science communication. So this is something we can use as an outline for any activity we're planning, starting with a goal, audience, platform, some way to evaluate, and then being able to collect that outcome and how we can refine and repeat through this process. So one of the big tools and resources that I've been developing for you all is called our Maryland Pollinator Week Toolkit. So this is our first draft. I'm hoping that this will begin to evolve and change, especially from input from you all. Whether that be letting me know what you like and don't like about the toolkit as you begin to explore it, as well as providing some of your own favorite resources and content that you've been developing over the years. I know some of you have some really great pollinator activities and engagement tools. So if you're willing to share them, especially across the state and beyond, I'd love to have one resource with this toolkit where all of us can begin to tap into the different tools and educational resources that we've been using. So you can find the toolkit here. I can also link it down below in the chat. And it's currently housed within a box folder. It should be public, free to share and use. We may find a different home for it on one of our University of Maryland Extension website pages, but this is just the early stages of it. So you are the first ones to see it and to be able to explore with it. So that's pretty exciting. Now, what are things that are included in the toolkit? So here's an example activity, and I encourage you to look on your screen here. We have 8 different insects shown on the screen. So can you spot the one bee? So one of these insects is a bee, the other insects are flies or bee mimics. If you have a guess, you can put it down in the chat below. Give you another moment to review all the different flying insects that we're seeing. So we have our bee identified here. How many of you got it right? And if you didn't get it right, don't feel bad. I know I tested this out with a friend and she managed to pick all of the other ones as bees before she got to the bee as last. And it kind of made me happy because that was the purpose of this activity or graphic, is to show the diversity of our different fly species that we have, which can act as bee mimics. And this could potentially help them to better avoid predators, right? Because some of our bees can be intimidating. And so our one bee was our Western honeybee up on our top one from the left. All of our other insects that we're seeing are different types of flies. And all of these can be found in Maryland and are important pollinators. So this is one type of activity that can be found in the toolkit as both a handout, which is shown on our left, and as a social media graphic, which is on our right. So whatever way you wish to engage, these are some potential options that you can utilize within your own spaces and communities. Another tool that I was really excited to develop and would love your input in is what are called the Maryland Pollinator cards. And so each one of these cards focuses on a specific pollinator species, and it is a front and back card. So we can see the front here of 4 different pollinator cards. And then if you flip it over, this is the back side. And so this features information on the pollinator's diet, habitat or nesting, general flower preferences, as well as winter location. And then on the very bottom, I provide one key native pollinator plant that helps to support this species and has a photo of it there. And so this is a potential tool. You can get creative with it. I also thought about this morning how you don't have to print them front and back. It may be a really cool activity if you keep them separate, the front and the back, and have people match them together based on the information on that back sheet. Can they guess what pollinator this belongs to? And so far I have designed 8 different pollinator cards. There's a lot of opportunity here to develop more. We have thousands of different insect species alone and even more pollinators throughout Maryland. So I'm excited to see how this goes. see what you all think of it, what our communities think of it, to see if we would like to develop more of these. And so within the Pollinator Toolkit, it comes as different PDF pages all together, and you can print them out and cut them out the way you like, whether that be printing them front and back or keeping them separated. Now, another aspect to these pollinator cards is I color-coded them to designate our generalist pollinators versus our specialist pollinators. So we have an opportunity here to integrate this aspect into any activity that we utilize these cards with. And so our generalist pollinators are ones that use a wide variety of plants to meet their needs versus our specialist pollinators rely on just a small group or even a single species of plant for food. Now, many of our printables, like our Maryland Pollinator cards that we just saw, will come with some instructions. So right before you get to that printable section or the different content of pieces. And so for instance, on our left, we can see our Maryland Pollinator cards. We have an introductory section. We have printing instructions. And many of these activities are cards. I'm going to talk about a trifold display you can print out, as well as a youth pollination activity instructions guide. These will have a corresponding Qualtrics survey. And so we can see that linked with our URL here, as well as a corresponding QR code. And so I just ask if you use the Maryland Pollinator cards, the display, or the youth pollinator activity that you take the time to fill out this brief survey to let me know how it went, if you liked using the particular content, and any other feedback that you have. This really helps provide me with input on how things are going, what content is being used, and who it is reaching throughout Maryland and beyond. So here's that display I was talking about. I thought I would start with one. I have a couple different displays that I've been developing over the past year or so. And so for this year, I have put together different printable elements to be able to build your own trifold display board that can go on a table, or even I put it in front of a table before. And this particular one is about some of our lesser known pollinators, our fly and beetle pollinators. So we can see this is a layout of how it's organized. Of course, you can get creative with the different elements and include or edit or remove different things, but I have fun facts on our left panel. On our center panel, we have images of different beetle and fly pollinator species that can be found in Maryland. And on our right, we have key ways to support pollinators. And so how this looks within the pollinator kit is I have pieced out all these different elements from the display board on 11 by 8.5 document sheets. And so you would print out each of these sheets, cut out and trim as you would like, and then paste them on the board. You can either reference this layout of how I originally designed it, or you can get creative with it. And so I used this board during last year's Pollinator Week at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. We were in the kids and family section, and it was a lot of fun. So this is how the display board looked when I put it together. I chose to laminate my different pieces. I had a Velcro board, so I was able to Velcro the different pieces to it. And I paired it off with different handouts, as well as other different activities. So I was able to utilize a microscope and different pinned insects that were there, as well as a life stage matching game up on our top right, and a pollinator chalk activity. So crushed yellow chalk to act as pollen for people to move around with the different pollinators. So with here, I find that what I've learned is it's important to have multiple means of engagement. So multiple ways for people to engage with different pollinator topics, and always preparing for a range of ages, right? So this was focused on a lot of youth, but I had people of all ages walking into the museum and wanting to learn more about pollinators. And so a lot of these activities can be geared toward a certain age range, but they can also span age ranges, right? Our adults like to get crafty and hands-on too. So maybe this pollen chalk pollinator activity may seem like it's for our youth, but I've seen a lot of different ages interact with it as well. So here I have titled it our youth pollination activity. But again, we can get creative. I'm sure all ages would have fun engaging with our chalk pollen and seeing how that works and mimics the way that pollinators move pollen around between our plants. And so we have an instruction guide for this. We have a survey for it if you do utilize it. And here are some example printable elements on our right. And so when we print these out, this is an example of how I put it together, and this is all included in the instructions. I know some of us Maryland Master Gardeners have our own form of a similar activity, whether we have an activity mimicking collecting nectar from different flowers or pollen. I've seen all different types of formats on how this can go. And so this is an easy one that I found works really well and can be done at any sort of different community events, can be easy to pack away and to put on the table. And you can even leave it be on its own, maybe having a little tabletop paper to explain what it is and what it may mean, but it doesn't require a lot of hands-on instruction or guidance. And so I usually like to use some sort of tablecloth because the chalk can get pretty messy, and then using some sort of plate to capture the pollen. I like to laminate my different flowers, put a pile of crushed yellow chalk to act as the pollen on top, and then I'll have laminated insects with pipe cleaner legs so that they're fuzzy and hairy like our pollinators to pick up that pollen. Now, if we have a longer format session, I've also led it where I have the kids design their own pollinator using popsicle sticks, different coloring utensils, as well as those pipe cleaner legs and potentially wings. And so they can get unique, design their own pollinator, and then take turns moving around the room to move that chalk pollen around. Since chalk can come in all sorts of colors, I've also found it's an opportunity here to have different piles of different chalk or pollen colors, have the different groups of kids move around the room with the different flowers and colors between this. And so they can visualize cross-pollination and that movement of different pollen stations throughout the room. So moving the different colors to different flowers and how that works. So I hope that began to give you some ideas. I'm sure this has sparked up some ideas and activities you've been leading or have already done. I would love to hear about them and potentially how we could add them to our Maryland Pollinator Week toolkit. So this leads us to our last section, which is to grow the change, working together to make an impact. And so one of the very last pages of this Maryland Pollinator Toolkit is one of my favorites because it is titled Sharing Your Ideas, Projects, and Events. So I want to hear from you all in terms of what you're already doing, what you have been doing in relation to pollinator education. It doesn't have to be specific to National Pollinator Week. We could have pollinator year. This can go on in all different seasons in terms of getting the word out. And so if you have a pollinator related event coming up or at any time of the year, please reach out to me. If you have event photos, even better. If you have an idea or request or want to share materials for next year's toolkit, please also reach out to me. And there's always opportunities to collaborate, whether that be with me directly or other home horticulture faculty and staff in our county-based Master Gardener programs. And so I unfortunately can't get out to every event, although I would love to, especially if it's a pollinator insect event, and to see more of your faces. So please note that I might not be able to get out to your event, but I love hearing about them, and I hope to get to at least one of them sometime in the near future. And so we'll go through some different topics or themes that we can connect to pollinators, right? Maybe we're more focused on native plants typically with our education and materials. Well, this relates directly to our pollinators, right? A lot of our pollinators and beneficial insects rely on native plants for food and shelter. And in turn, a lot of our native plants rely on pollinators for reproduction, moving that pollen around for cross-pollination. We can visualize this in different ways in terms of showing the connections between different wildlife, pollinators, and our native plants. We can show how we can make a difference in terms of are more managed in urbanized spaces. So even a small pollinator patch or even a potted plant on a porch can be a pit stop for our different pollinators as they move between our bigger green spaces. There are also lots of different roles that our particular insect groups can play beyond just pollination. And a lot of our species play multiple roles. So some of our pollinators are also parasitic or predators within our landscape, helping to provide sustainable pest control. We also have our decomposers and our nutrient cyclers. And if we are a fan of other wildlife, say our native birds, different caterpillars and other insects are vital food sources to support these different food webs. We can also focus on those generalists versus the specialists, as I mentioned with our Maryland pollinator cards, boosting and demonstrating the importance of providing a diversity of different native plant species, as some of our specialists rely on such a small group. So it's really important to boost our plant diversity where we can. Within the toolkit, I do have a page for each one of these flower petals for creating a pollinator haven. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to include a lot of photos. So if you would like more photos, please let me know and I can include that in next year's toolkit. But I do outline key points for each one of these ways to support our pollinators. And so that helps give us some more background information when we are designing our activities and we are speaking with the public. Some of you may be well versed in a lot of these different factors and ways we could support pollinators, but it can be helpful to have a centralized resource, right, to be able to reference and maybe have some example language to reference. There are also different ways we can demonstrate with either graphics or photos of our own green spaces for ways we can improve different outdoor sections by adding more plant diversity, adding clean, shallow sources of water, incorporating companion plants, maybe our flowering herbs to support our nectaring pollinators, planting milkweed on the edges of our garden beds for easy access for our monarchs, and so much more. There are lots of different ways to get engaged with our community, whether that be a workshop, a pollinator-themed festival, like I'll be joining our Washington County Master Gardeners with coming up soon. There are different bio blitzes where we get out there and help with participatory science, gathering data and photos on different pollinators. Even educational sign can have a big difference in your yard. So if you're leaving the leaves in the fall for our pollinators, like our overwintering moths and butterflies, having a sign there to indicate why those leaves have been left, even showing some of those pollinators that rely on that leaf litter, can really begin to spread the word and have an impact within your own neighborhood. So this leads to one of my trainer tips for today, which is to create opportunities for all to get involved with hands-on pollinator conservation activities. These experiences can lead to fascination, empathy, and a personal sense of efficacy as supported by some of our research. So I know some of you have participated in some of these different activities, from planting different pollinator gardens, from leading butterfly counts and tours, so many cool ways to spread the word. Now, if you're someone who is interested in participatory science, this is a really important way for us to learn more about our pollinators and different animals. There is still so much we don't know, especially with our changing climate. So it can be as easy as snapping a photo and uploading it through an app or an online participatory science project. One of my favorite ones is iNaturalist. I use their Seek app quite a bit, as well as they have a separate iNaturalist app and their online website. And so snapping a photo, getting those GPS locations, as well as potentially the host plant they are on for talking about our pollinators. We also have our great backyard bird count, our bumblebee watch, our project ground nesting bee, Journey North, which is monarch tracking, our city nature challenge, and I'm sure there are more that we could add to this list. So we'll take a moment here and we're going to launch a poll about Pollinator Week and whether you have celebrated Pollinator Week before. And if so, what sort of activities did you participate in? And no worries, if you're brand new to celebrating Pollinator Week, welcome. I'm very excited for you. There's lots of different ways to get involved as we're learning today. Steph, do we have our Pollinator Week poll? Can't see it for some reason.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries.
Okay, and that one's just 2 questions, right?
Yes, just 2
Okay,
questions.
I got it. There we go.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I was reading more in the comments last time. If you can't see the polls, if you're using the web browser, it might be that your browser has pop-ups blocked, and so click the little picture of the pop-up in the URL bar in your web browser, and that might help for you to see it.
And if for some reason you still can't see the poll or quiz, feel free to write in the chat box below if you've celebrated Pollinator Week before, and if so, what are some ways that you celebrated?
Okay, we've got 80%. I'll go ahead and end it.
Awesome, thank you, Stephanie. And I'm putting in the chat box the link to the Maryland Pollinator Week Toolkit.
Oh, I just did.
Oh, awesome, thank you. Thank you,
Yep.
thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so returning back to our key objectives for Pollinator Week, we can begin to think about these, which one sparks our interest the most in terms of how we would like to celebrate Pollinator Week 2025. And so we'll end today with imagining what objectives we want to address and what themes interest us the most. And so with this, we'll have our final poll for today. I promise we have so many polls going on, but we can also write this down on a piece of paper, think about it in our heads with these 3 particular prompts. And the first one is, what is one activity or resource you were excited to try or explore? Could be something I mentioned today, something related to our Maryland Pollinator Week toolkit, could be the toolkit itself, could be the Maryland Pollinator cards, could be another resource that you've recently discovered. Second prompt is, what is one pollinator related action you plan to do in June, celebrating our Pollinator Week? And third, what is one topic you still want to learn more about? And so I would love to hear from you what other webinars, workshops you would like to participate in, what topics you would like to delve into a bit more as we look to the future. So that poll should be popping up on your screen now, hopefully. And as you're filling that out, I'd just like to mention that today's additional resources are going to be a part of that Maryland Pollinator Week toolkit. And so there are a couple different pages for youth resources as well as teen and adult ones related to things with pollinator identification, general pollinator information, as well as information on native plants, because we wouldn't have our pollinators without our native plants. We wouldn't have our native plants without our pollinators. So this goes hand in hand. And it's important to integrate native plant education with our pollinator education. So I have a page shown on the screen here. This is included in the toolkit with all the different native plant resources. And of course, if you think of more resources to add to this sheet, please let me know. Now, to reference some upcoming webinars, next week we have a webinar on May 21st, next Wednesday, same time from noon to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a virtual webinar, and I'm going to be diving into buzzworthy beescaping and empowering others to cultivate native bee habitats. So if you could join us, wonderful. This will also be recorded and posted to our UMD Home and Garden Information Center YouTube page. And then saving the date, I'm also planning to have something in celebration of National Moth Week, which is July 19th through the 27th. So on Wednesday, July 16th, will be a moth-friendly Maryland webinar. So please stay tuned for the registration for that. If you're looking for even more content, I highly recommend PBS's new show, which came out with its first episode called Insect Apocalypse. So the series is called Bugs That Rule the World. This is the first episode. You can find it online at pbs.org. I found this really fascinating. It really lit the fire within me and helped fuel that passion for what I do in terms of advocating for pollinators and other different types of insects. They highlight different researchers in different areas of the world and all the different things that our pollinators are unfortunately facing in different ways that we can support them. So I'm really excited for the different episodes that will be released. But again, I highly recommend this if you're looking for a new watch. With that, I hope you all keep in touch. There is a Qualtrics survey on here you can reference later if you'd like. I know we're doing so many surveys, but if this is the way you'd like to kind of keep in touch and let me know what you're doing, you can fill out this survey, which is anonymous, or you can email me directly too. I love seeing photos, whether that be a photo of your pollinator garden, your festival that you're planning. If you use the Maryland pollinator cards, I want to see it all. I also love to gather feedback. And so there is a university hosted teaching feedback survey. Again, you're welcome to reference this later, maybe when you have less survey fatigue. But this is a really important way for me to hear from you so I can improve my teaching and programs coming up. With that, we've come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for engaging and interacting with our virtual polls, if you could, as well as our chat box and our Q&A feature. My email is on the screen here. Please check out that Maryland Pollinator Week toolkit. If you ever have trouble finding it, feel free to email me directly and I can send you the link. I'm sure we'll find a better home for it somewhere on our web pages. But with this, I'm happy to spend our remaining time answering any questions. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your week.
Awesome. Thank you, Maddie. I'm getting lots of good comments in the chat. Of course, folks are super appreciative, so thank you so much for that. And in case anybody was looking for the information for Maddie's next webinar, in order to register for that, I've put that link in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Steph.
Someone has also shared in the Q&A that tonight on Maryland Public Television, they're going to have a show called Nature, My Garden of 1,000 Bees. So make sure to tune in for that too if you're interested. Okay, someone is asking, can we get the toolkit in PDF? The link in the chat is not downloadable. So on my end, it is looking downloadable and I am not logged in. So if you click the link in the chat for Maddie's Pollinator Week Toolkit, on the top right corner, you'll see a white button that says download. And if you click download, it'll say your download is in progress, and then it should show up in the downloads folder on your computer. Okay, we have another question about, is the presentation itself going to be shared? So we are sharing the recording, and I believe Maddie's also okay with sharing slides. Okay,
Yep, definitely.
awesome. So yes, you will see the recording as well as the slides from this presentation. Someone missed information from a couple slides back, so you can always watch the recording or check out the slides later on. This is a good question. Are master gardeners able to bring insects to the office for identification?
That is a great question. I
Indeed.
don't typically receive samples, especially from the public, because there can be a lot that goes into kind of setting boundaries for what I accept and don't accept. We can get samples of all different kinds of non-insect things that are considered insects. So it's just something to be mindful of. I recommend starting with a really clear photo, both zoomed in and far away, and sending it to us through our UMD Ask extension form. And if we have trouble being able to identify it through your photos, we can work from there and potentially look into different resources, microscopes, etc.
Absolutely. Great point. Thank you. And then I know that there was a question in the chat, so let me scroll back and see if I can rescue that one. Okay, when you were talking about the loss of honeybees in the hives, was there a particular cause that was identified for that loss?
So I think the example you were referring to was it was a group of bumblebees, so different than honeybees that were impacted by different pesticide sprays on linden trees. So different than our honeybees, but our honeybees are unfortunately facing devastating losses and declines right now. That can be because of pesticide use, but also because of different diseases and pests that they're facing. They have mites that can infest them, unfortunately. So they are facing a lot of pressures as well as our bumblebees.
Absolutely. That's always a good reminder and clarification that not all bees are just bees. There's different kinds. Okay, so lots of kudos and thank yous and appreciations in the chat, Maddie. This was fantastic as always. Thank you so much for presenting this for us today. I think we're all super excited, really amped up and ready to go for National Pollinator Week.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie and Caitlin, for hosting, and thank you all for joining. Please stay in touch. Let me know how you're celebrating.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie.